If you are over the age of 55, you have likely felt that sudden, terrifying sensation of profound mental fatigue washing over you in the middle of a perfectly normal afternoon, leaving you grasping desperately for a simple word, or struggling intensely to follow the basic thread of a conversation. You are immediately told by society, by the media, and often by well-meaning medical professionals, that your brain is simply slowing down, that this terrifying cognitive fog is just a natural, entirely unavoidable casualty of the normal aging process. That is a deeply dangerous, highly placating lie, designed specifically to keep you completely blind to a massive, microscopic massacre currently occurring deep inside your skull right now. The ultimate stakes we are discussing today are nothing less than your absolute, permanent personal independence and the total, beautiful preservation of your deepest, most foundational memories. Today, we are going to completely expose a catastrophic, generational dietary mistake heavily mandated in the 1950s that is actively, continuously suffocating your delicate brain cells. And we will reveal the exact, incredibly simple, entirely free biological swap you absolutely must make in your kitchen tonight to instantly halt the silent microstrokes that are quietly erasing your mind. For entirely too long, the modern medical establishment and the highly profitable pharmaceutical industry have placed a massive, suffocating burden of guilt squarely onto your tired shoulders. Whenever you bravely confided in a physician that you were feeling utterly lost in an impenetrable cognitive fog, or that your memory was terrifyingly slipping away, you were subtly but firmly told that it was somehow your own fault. You were lectured that you simply ate entirely too much dietary cholesterol, that you failed to exercise with enough intensity, or that you unfortunately just possessed a deeply tragic, unchangeable genetic flaw. It is absolutely imperative that you understand right now, in this exact moment, that the terrifying cognitive decline you are currently experiencing is absolutely not your fault. You have been the completely unwitting victim of the most massive, highly coordinated, and deeply tragic systemic failure in the entire recorded history of nutritional science. You were forcefully, aggressively directed by the highest government health agencies to completely, permanently abandon the deeply ancient, highly protective, natural fats that human beings had safely and beautifully relied upon for thousands upon thousands of years. You were sternly instructed to throw away the rich butter, the deeply nourishing beef tallow, and the natural dairy, and you were told to instead flood your physical body with massive, overwhelming amounts of highly processed, heavily industrialized, perfectly clear cooking oils, born entirely inside massive chemical laboratories. You were confidently promised that this massive, sweeping dietary switch would completely protect your aging heart. But absolutely no one ever warned you that this exact same highly processed oil was quietly, systematically starving your brain of vital oxygen and actively sparking a raging, invisible chemical fire deep within your central nervous system. To truly, comprehensively understand the terrifying origin of this invisible enemy, we must look backward in time to the early 1950s. A massive post-war era deeply defined by rapid industrialization and a rising, unprecedented national fear of sudden heart disease among middle-aged men. The nation was completely desperate for an immediate sweeping answer, and the massive agricultural industry, sitting quietly on completely unprecedented, overwhelmingly massive surpluses of cheap soybeans, heavily subsidized corn, and massive piles of discarded cotton seeds, brilliantly and ruthlessly manufactured a highly profitable, deeply synthetic solution. Before this specific modern era, human beings never ever consumed cottonseed oil, soybean oil, or heavy corn oil in any significant measurable quantities. The biological reason for this is deeply profound. In their raw, entirely natural state, these highly defended seeds are incredibly toxic to human digestion and absolutely physically impossible to press into oil using simple, ancient traditional methods. They are, quite literally, harsh agricultural waste products. But the deeply clever industrial food complex quickly realized that by subjecting these useless, hard seeds to terrifying, hyper-industrialized, deeply unnatural chemical processes, they could extract a cheap, entirely tasteless liquid. They crushed millions of tons of these seeds under immense, heavy mechanical pressure, completely and violently flooded the crushed mash with highly toxic, highly volatile petroleum-based chemical solvents, exactly like hexane, and then physically boiled the resulting liquid at terrifying temperatures, far exceeding 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Because this deeply tortured, highly refined oil emerged smelling exactly like deeply rancid, rotting, putrid fish, they aggressively chemically deodorized it and heavily bleached it until it was completely clear. They finally poured this highly refined industrial solvent into beautiful, perfectly clear plastic bottles and aggressively, relentlessly marketed it to your mother, and eventually directly to you, as the absolute pinnacle of modern, heart-healthy, scientific nutrition. They completely, successfully convinced an entire generation of trusting individuals to enthusiastically fry their daily food, passionately bake their family bread, and heavily dress their healthy green salads in what is fundamentally, biologically functioning as heavily oxidized industrial machine lubricant. While this highly profitable, entirely synthetic agricultural machine was roaring into massive global motion, your highly sensitive, incredibly demanding physical brain was silently, tragically suffering the devastating, completely invisible consequences of this unnatural experiment. Your central nervous system is an absolute, undeniable metabolic marvel. Despite its soft, delicate appearance, it is physically composed of roughly 60% pure, complex, highly structural fats. The highly delicate, incredibly thin, deeply vital outer membrane wrapping completely around every single one of your 86 billion individual neurons is entirely constructed from these specific dietary fats that you physically swallow. You must deeply understand that this microscopic cellular membrane is absolutely not just a passive, static brick wall. It is a highly dynamic, incredibly intelligent, aggressively active biological security system. It must be perfectly, exactly fluid enough to seamlessly allow vital, life-saving nutrients, massive amounts of circulating oxygen, and lightning-fast electrical signals to effortlessly pass directly inside the cell. Simultaneously, it must be completely structurally strong enough to aggressively, ruthlessly lock out deeply damaging circulating toxins and highly dangerous heavy metals. For countless thousands of years, your brilliant, highly evolved physical body beautifully and flawlessly constructed these vital, protective neural walls, using the deeply stable, incredibly robust saturated fats and the rich, natural omega-3 fatty acids found abundantly and naturally in the wild human environment. But when you completely unknowingly obeyed the modern dietary guidelines and aggressively began consuming massive, unnatural amounts of highly unstable, deeply processed polyunsaturated seed oils, a terrifying, silent biological substitution occurred deep within the dark confines of your skull. Your highly desperate, deeply starving brain, completely lacking the stable ancient fats it desperately required to survive, was physically, tragically forced to begin rapidly constructing your fragile neural membranes entirely out of the heavily processed, highly unstable industrial seed oils currently aggressively circulating in your warm bloodstream. This exact forced cellular substitution is precisely where the catastrophic, completely invisible biological failure begins. Polyunsaturated fats, by their very specific, highly delicate chemical definition, are incredibly biologically fragile. Their complex molecular structure contains multiple, highly exposed double bonds that are intensely, violently reactive to natural light, to ambient heat, and most critically, to the presence of heavy oxygen. When these highly unstable, entirely fragile industrial fats are forcefully, permanently embedded directly into the delicate, vital walls of your precious brain cells, they act exactly, precisely, like millions of microscopic sticks of biological dynamite simply waiting for a chemical spark. And your highly demanding, aggressively active brain is the ultimate, roaring, unstoppable spark. Your brain fiercely, relentlessly consumes an astonishing 20% of your body's entire circulating oxygen supply every single minute that you are alive and breathing. When that massive, heavy, rushing river of highly concentrated volatile oxygen physically, aggressively interacts with the deeply fragile, heavily processed industrial seed oils permanently trapped inside your neural membranes, It violently triggers a devastating, aggressive chemical chain reaction, known clinically in neurology as massive lipid peroxidation. I want you to deeply visualize exactly what physically happens when you accidentally leave a beautiful piece of unprotected, raw iron outside in the heavy, relentless, corrosive rain. It aggressively, relentlessly rusts, becoming terribly brittle, deeply weak, and ultimately violently crumbling into useless red dust. Massive lipid peroxidation is exactly, precisely, and undeniably the biological equivalent of your living, precious brain cells violently rusting from the very inside out. This aggressive, raging, deeply silent internal cellular rusting does not merely damage the individual isolated neurons. It completely, ruthlessly targets, heavily attacks, and systematically destroys the millions of microscopic, incredibly fragile blood vessels deeply responsible for keeping those very neurons alive. Deep within the massive, complex architecture of your brain, your massive, thick cardiovascular superhighways eventually branch down into incredibly tiny, completely microscopic capillaries. These vital, life-saving vessels are so unimaginably, profoundly narrow that your individual red blood cells must physically fold themselves completely in half, traveling slowly in a single-file line just to squeeze through and safely deliver their life-saving payload of oxygen to the deep, dense tissues of your hippocampus, which is the exact, specific center of your brain entirely responsible for storing your memories. The incredibly delicate, single-cell thick lining of these microscopic capillaries is known as the vascular endothelium. When the highly toxic, heavily oxidized, deeply rusting seed oils violently circulating in your blood physically collide with this deeply delicate endothelial lining, they violently, aggressively strip vital electrons directly away from the soft tissue. This aggressive microscopic chemical attack instantly triggers a massive systemic raging wave of deep neuroinflammation. The severely inflamed, highly irritated, deeply traumatized blood vessel walls physically swell inward, tragically, aggressively narrowing the already microscopic, highly restricted pathway. Furthermore, the violent, unrelenting oxidative stress completely chemically destroys the vessel's fundamental biological ability to naturally produce a miraculous gas called nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is the vital, life-saving chemical signal that gently commands the blood vessel to safely dilate, physically expand, and beautifully relax. Without this vital gas, the highly critical pathway becomes completely stiff, deeply rigid, completely paralyzed, and dangerously, terrifyingly narrow. This aggressive, progressive vascular narrowing brings us directly to the terrifying, completely silent physiological event occurring continuously inside your skull. As you sit comfortably in your living room chair, peacefully reading a book or quietly watching television, a microscopic red blood cell, heavily carrying the exact vital oxygen your memory center desperately needs to function, slowly approaches the severely narrowed, heavily inflamed, incredibly rigid microscopic capillary. Because the damaged vessel absolutely cannot physically dilate to accommodate the cell, the red blood cell violently, suddenly jams. It physically becomes completely, inextricably stuck, completely and entirely blocking the vital, life-saving flow of blood to the exact region behind it. You must understand that this is absolutely not a massive, catastrophic, highly visible, life-altering stroke that tragically paralyzes half of your physical body, slurs your speech, and sends you rushing immediately to the emergency room with blaring sirens. This is a completely silent, entirely invisible, highly localized microstroke. It occurs in an area of your brain so incredibly microscopic that your conscious, awake mind does not even register a single fraction of immediate pain. But the highly sensitive, incredibly demanding, beautifully complex neurons, situated directly downstream from that microscopic blockage, are instantly, violently starved of oxygen. Within a matter of mere agonizing minutes, those precious, memory-holding vital brain cells quietly, permanently suffocate, entirely collapse, and permanently die. These tiny, silent, deeply invisible microstrokes are absolutely not rare, isolated incidents. For older adults who are continuously consuming a standard, highly processed modern diet that is completely saturated with heavily hidden industrial seed oils, These devastating microstrokes are actively occurring hundreds, if not many thousands, of times every single week, steadily, quietly, and entirely irreversibly eroding the massive, complex neural networks responsible for maintaining your entire personal identity. This profound, entirely silent, deeply invisible cellular suffocation directly translates into the exact, terrifying daily physical symptoms that you have been falsely, heavily led to believe are just the normal, expected progression of aging. When a highly concentrated cluster of these tiny microstrokes violently obliterates a microscopic section of your deep temporal lobe, you suddenly, inexplicably, and embarrassingly lose the ability to recall a deeply familiar name, a beloved place, or a simple, common noun right in the middle of a flowing, confident sentence. When the silent, suffocating, relentless damage aggressively hits the vast, complex spatial mapping centers of your parietal lobes, you walk confidently and purposefully into a room, and instantly, completely, and terrifyingly lose the specific vital thread of your immediate intention, leaving you completely blank. Your incredibly brilliant, desperately surviving brain is continuously, aggressively attempting to painstakingly reroute its complex electrical signals entirely around these newly formed microscopic craters of dead, suffocating tissue. But the constant, heavy, unrelenting computational effort required to build these detours requires a massive, crippling, entirely exhausting amount of cellular energy to sustain. This massive energy drain is precisely, exactly why you can sleep heavily for 8, 9, or even 10 solid, uninterrupted hours in your highly comfortable bed, yet somehow wake up in the morning feeling utterly, completely, and profoundly drained, as if your physical limbs are filled with heavy, cold, unyielding lead. Your conscious, dreaming mind was trying desperately to rest, but your physical, living brain was desperately, exhaustingly fighting a terrifying, completely invisible biological war to simply keep the heavy blood flowing against a relentless, aggressive tide of deeply toxic, heavily oxidized, thoroughly rusted dietary oil. The sudden, deeply profound realization that your completely innocent daily meals may be quietly, actively, and aggressively destroying your beautiful mind can feel deeply overwhelming and profoundly, intensely terrifying. But I assure you, with absolute, unyielding, deeply scientific certainty, it is precisely this exact, incredibly specific, highly actionable knowledge that permanently hands you the ultimate, undeniable, complete power to completely halt the devastating microvascular damage and aggressively, remarkably, begin to physically heal the structure of your mind. Because this devastating, invisible damage is being heavily, actively driven by a continuous, highly external, easily controllable dietary exposure, rather than a permanent, unchangeable, deeply tragic genetic flaw, you possess the profound, immediate, absolute ability to physically stop the cellular rusting tonight. The absolute first, completely non-negotiable, intensely critical step in this profound cognitive rescue protocol requires ruthlessly, systematically, and completely securing the physical perimeter of your own kitchen. You must aggressively, intentionally identify and completely entirely eliminate the deeply toxic, highly unstable industrial seed oils currently hiding silently in your pantry and your refrigerator. You must immediately become a ruthless, highly observant, deeply skeptical biological detective, carefully and intensely scanning the tiny, highly deceptive ingredient labels of every single bottle, glass jar, and plastic package in your home. You are actively searching for, and immediately permanently throwing into the heavy garbage, absolutely anything containing highly processed soybean oil, heavily industrialized canola oil, massive amounts of highly refined corn oil, deeply toxic cottonseed oil, or completely artificial, heavily processed sunflower and safflower oils. You must deeply internalize that these highly unstable, easily oxidized, deeply destructive fats are completely, overwhelmingly ubiquitous. They are deeply, intentionally, and heavily hidden in highly marketed, supposedly incredibly healthy salad dressings, heavily processed, thick mayonnaise, commercially baked, highly soft breads, perfectly crispy crackers, and almost all pre-packaged, highly convenient, easily accessible snack foods. By systematically, aggressively, and ruthlessly removing these microscopic sticks of biological dynamite completely from your daily biological routine, you are instantly, effortlessly, and powerfully completely halting the heavy, continuous, devastating oxidative assault on your delicate, deeply vital neurovascular system. Once you have successfully, brilliantly, and courageously stopped the aggressive chemical bleeding inside your brain, we must immediately, aggressively focus deeply inward on the profound, highly urgent, deeply biological task of physically replacing those deeply fragile, heavily damaged neural cell walls with massive, highly concentrated amounts of the exact, deeply stable biological building blocks your brain is quite literally, physically begging for. You must immediately, proudly, and enthusiastically completely return to the deeply traditional, highly protective, wonderfully ancient cooking fats that your brilliant, robust, deeply healthy ancestors beautifully thrived upon for millennia. You must completely, joyfully embrace the massive, deeply stabilizing, entirely protective power of highly saturated, deeply natural, heavy animal fats. These are absolutely magnificent, deeply nourishing fats like purely rendered, grass-fed beef tallow, rich, deeply golden pasture-raised butter, and highly clarified, deeply pure ghee. Because the specific complex chemical structure of these deeply natural, perfectly designed fats contains absolutely zero fragile, highly reactive double bonds, they are profoundly, physically, and completely impervious to the violent, aggressive oxidative damage of ambient light, intense cooking heat, and heavy circulating oxygen. When your deeply starving, highly desperate brain eagerly, aggressively incorporates these deeply solid, highly stable, perfectly natural fats directly into your delicate, vital neural membranes, it actively, physically constructs an impenetrable, heavily armored, deeply brilliant biological shield completely around your precious, vulnerable neurons. They instantly become violently, fiercely resistant to the massive internal rusting that directly causes the deadly, silent microstrokes, physically guaranteeing their long-term survival. For those individuals who may naturally feel deeply hesitant about consuming massive, heavy amounts of rich animal fats due to long decades of intense, completely false societal conditioning, or for those who simply naturally prefer a much lighter, more delicate, deeply nuanced culinary profile, you can absolutely, brilliantly, and perfectly achieve the exact same profound, sweeping neurological protection by highly strategically utilizing highly concentrated, deeply pure, massively powerful monounsaturated fats. The absolute, undeniable, historically undisputed king of this deeply protective biological class is high-quality, completely cold-pressed, entirely unrefined, deeply authentic extra virgin olive oil. True, deeply authentic, incredibly fresh olive oil is heavily, densely, and remarkably packed with an incredibly potent, highly specific, deeply complex antioxidant compound known scientifically as oleocanthal. Oleocanthal possesses a truly unique, almost completely miraculous biological ability that defies standard digestion. It effortlessly, seamlessly, and completely crosses the highly restrictive, heavily guarded, massive blood-brain barrier. Once it is safely inside the deeply protected sanctuary of your central nervous system, oleocanthal operates exactly, precisely, and actively like a microscopic, highly targeted, deeply aggressive biological fire extinguisher. It violently seeks out and aggressively, ruthlessly neutralizes the deep, raging, silent neuroinflammation that is actively swelling and suffocating your delicate capillaries. It violently, chemically forces the damaged, entirely rigid, deeply narrowed blood vessels to beautifully, safely, and completely dilate, physically throwing the microscopic circulatory doors completely wide open and violently rushing a massive, incredibly powerful, life-saving wave of deeply life-giving, highly oxygenated, perfectly clean blood straight back into the deep tissue of your starving hippocampus. However, simply shielding your brilliant brain with deeply stable fats and forcefully putting out the raging inflammatory fire is only the very beginning of the profound restorative process. To aggressively, physically, and beautifully rebuild the massive, highly complex, deeply intricate neural superhighways that have been tragically, violently disconnected by long years of silent, suffocating microstrokes, you must continuously, heavily flood your physical system with the absolute most critical, highly specific, structurally massive neuro-fat in all of human biology. Docosahexaenoic acid, or simply highly concentrated DHA. DHA is a highly complex, incredibly long-chain, deeply vital omega-3 fatty acid that your highly demanding brain absolutely cannot magically, biologically manufacture on its own. It must be completely, heavily, and intentionally imported directly through your daily diet. You must aggressively, purposefully, and highly intentionally saturate your entire physical system with massive, overwhelming amounts of high-quality, highly bioavailable, deeply pure DHA by regularly, consistently consuming heavily fatty, entirely wild-caught, deeply cold-water fish, specifically pristine wild Alaskan salmon, small, highly oily sardines, and vital, nutrient-dense mackerel. By purposefully, continuously, and heavily flooding your internal biological ecosystem with these highly specialized, deeply neuroprotective, incredibly structural omega-3 fats, you are physically, mechanically guaranteeing the rapid, aggressive, highly beautifully construction of entirely new, highly robust, perfectly insulated synaptic connections that will rapidly bridge the dark gaps in your mind. As the heavy, suffocating, completely toxic burden of the highly oxidized, entirely rusted industrial seed oils is completely permanently eliminated from your physical body, and your delicate, highly vulnerable brain cells are brilliantly, beautifully, and aggressively rebuilt with deeply stable, highly structural, entirely ancient fats. Your traumatized, deeply suffocating, entirely exhausted mitochondria will finally, beautifully, and powerfully begin to breathe again. The microscopic, deeply vital blood vessels perfectly feeding your precious foundational memory centers will safely, naturally, and permanently remain completely wide open, perfectly delivering massive amounts of heavy oxygen. You will rapidly, undeniably begin to notice that the thick, completely impenetrable, highly terrifying cognitive fog completely effortlessly lifts, exactly as if a heavy, dark curtain has been aggressively pulled back in a completely dark room. You will rapidly, effortlessly, and beautifully recall highly specific names, incredibly complex historical dates, and deeply familiar, wonderful faces without a single tiny moment of terrifying hesitation. You will wake up every single morning feeling profoundly, deeply restored, completely unburdened by the heavy, invisible chemical war that had been silently raging inside your mind for decades. You are entirely, beautifully transforming your deep biological environment. You are no longer helplessly, passively, and terrifiedly waiting for the next silent microstroke to occur. You are actively, fiercely, and remarkably taking absolute, undeniable control of your own neurological destiny, guaranteeing your beautiful independence. But successfully swapping your cooking oils, stopping the massive lipid peroxidation, and powerfully rebuilding your delicate neural membranes is only the very first critical step in the ultimate longevity equation. All of this profound, life-saving vascular healing and massive circulatory restoration is entirely, utterly useless if the actual physical, heavy, muscular pumping mechanism of your heart itself is quietly, invisibly calcifying from a massive, completely hidden mineral deficiency occurring right now, deep within your bones. To immediately discover the completely silent, deeply terrifying vitamin warning sign appearing directly on the surface of your fingernails, and the incredibly simple, entirely free morning protocol you absolutely must implement tomorrow to instantly dissolve this dangerous calcification and safely protect your newly opened blood vessels. You need to click the video currently displayed on your screen right now.